AI is not going to replace the human ingenuity.
Dr. Sola is a mathematician and a scientist whose company HexisLab is leveraging AI in the world of beauty and skincare.
We've been service providers to different number of different brands using machine learning tools, AI tools to predict and to work out formulations and products that people can use in a different application, and also testing and validating some of those results in the lab.
He spotted a gap in the market for hair products engineered specifically for the African consumer due to the experience of his daughter, and that led to the birth of his brand.
The biology that produces the curly textured hair is very different from the biology that produces straight blonde hair. And the manifestation of the tresses and the hair types present different kind of challenges that require different kind of intervention. And that is quite obvious to me as a problem solver, which is what I've always done, to say, okay, well, we need to address some of these issues. And that's what led to creating a whole product. And you can't just create a product for one person, you have to create a brand.
Even though he studied in Nigeria and was working in one of the largest oil companies in the world, he knew he wanted more.
I had first class in mathematics. I needed to do more. I needed to expand. I needed to study a little bit more because I was not happy with what I was doing. And I've always wanted to have a doctorate degree in math since I was 9. So I went back to my passion essentially to find opportunity to get back to that.
In a world where many African researchers never turn their ideas into real-life products, Dr. Sola has found a way to build successful businesses around his research and ideas, and he has some advice for African researchers and academics.
You've got to have a lot of courage to take the next step, and patience, perseverance, because things get harder, and also making sure you get a good, honest assessment as to what problem you're trying to solve. If you have something that you love doing, you've got a hobby. If you have something that somebody else needs, then you have a business.
Busy as he is, Sola is very committed to building community and supporting African entrepreneurs.
It is important for me to find ways of supporting and helping people, and I've always done that. You've got to support other people in their journey as well, because that is one of the ways you pass on some of the knowledge and the wisdom that you've acquired. A lot of the time, everything that you need you already have, but you're just not conscious of it.
From mathematician to beautician and CEO, this is Sola Idowu, and this is Critical Factor. Dr. Sola, thank you for being here. So good to have you finally on the Critical Factor set.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
I mean, for a busy man like yourself, it was hard finding time that worked. So it's always good when we finally get to make things work like this. And we're just going to jump right to the deep end.
Great.
Because as I mentioned just before we started, the more we researched, the more we found. And so many parts of your life we want to touch on. And to get us started, to that person who's watching, who doesn't know you, could you do an introduction and tell them, why do you think this conversation would be important for them?
Oh, great. Well, my name is Sola Idowu. Born in Lagos. Came to the UK. Been in Newcastle now for about 30 years. I've had a complex, interesting journey from what I've done throughout my career to where I am now. So hope somebody could learn something from my journey as well.
That's a very modest way to put it. A complex journey, yeah?
Yeah, a complex journey, yeah.
But then I was watching one of your interviews and you were talking about how when you were in Lagos, the only thing you knew of Newcastle was the football club.
Yes.
But tell us about how that upbringing, that time in Lagos, impacted the person you are today.
Yeah, so I remember it was in primary school, walking back from school. So there is a woman that sells fried fish, by the railway station, and it used to be one of the fond memory, growing up as a child. So one of the newspaper clippings that was used to wrap the fish is always had a Newcastle United logo on it.
Right.
And yeah, so that is where the knowledge of Newcastle came from as a child. So it's always stuck with me, since I was a child.
And I think you did mention as well that you did some mentorship with Shell at some point.
So I actually did work in Shell.
Oh, you did?
Yes. So in Nigeria, after my first degree, I went to Lagos State University, where I graduated in mathematics. I had a first class. Then after that, I joined Arthur Anderson for a few years, business advisory. Then from there, I went into Shell, what we call the SNEPCO, Shell exploration and deep sea exploration. So that was a unit carved out from Shell in Nigeria in those days to look at deep sea exploration. So I was one of the first founding members of that unit. We were based in Now Building in Lagos Marina Road in those times, which was really an interesting time, exploring for, oil in the deep sea in Nigeria at that time.
That's interesting because you would find that most people who work in oil companies in Nigeria are not usually looking to leave the country. So, I mean, for you, why? Because clearly that would be you operating at a very successful level already.
Yeah.
What inspired the need to move?
So that's where Newcastle came in again. So my boss at that time
Yeah.
studied at Newcastle University.
Would that be Stewart Brown?
Stuart Brown, yeah.
Right.
Really, really kind, gentleman. And he watched me, what I did at that time. So if I put it into context, so it was actually a very complex, problem. So I studied mathematics. So what we were doing at that time was to analyze operating cost for deep sea exploration in Nigeria. So you had the joint venture contracts at that time with the Shell, with Nigerian government. Then you have what we call the new production sharing contract, which is a different rules within the government and the Shell. Then you have a venture that is not only controlled by Shell, but other people farmed into the venture. You have Ajip, you have all sorts of different companies. So you now have what they call almost like a cost nightmare, because every single cost you have to figure out where do you need to allocate it to. What is the rules of joint venture? What is the rule of production sharing contracts? And how do you account, because all of them have different rules for different costs.
Right.
So it becomes like a massive exercise. So I was writing programs in macros and Excel at that time to actually handle, amortization of cost and what cost you need to pass on through the SPDC, what cost you need to pass on to the partners, how do you report it to the government. So it was a really, really complex task, because that was the time before you had SAPs and all the accounting packages.
Gotcha.
So you have to code them into the system. So it was an involved process. So it brought all the mathematical analysis.
And that led you to choose to come to Newcastle? So what inspired the move?
So I know I needed, so I had first class in mathematics, and I used to be really clever,
Oh, you used to be.
I'm not so much, not as much as I used to be. I used to be, on top of things. So I needed to do more. I needed to expand. I needed to study a little bit more, because I was not happy with what I was doing. So, and I've always wanted to always wanted to have a doctorate degree in maths since I was 9. So I went back to my passion essentially to find opportunity to get back to that. So I've always had that desire, when I was 9 years old,
Interesting.
to have a doctorate degree in maths. There were a number of critical factors that led into that.
Right.
So I lived in a place called Idowu in Lagos at that time. So all the stories that I had as a child was 3 major guys. Adeboye, he did a PhD in maths. He was and very close to where we live. It leads a big church in Nigeria. Kumi had a, doctorate in maths. It was at University of Lagos. And there's a guy called Awujobi who was like a brilliant mathematician that, everybody talked about in Nigeria at that time. Then my brother was at University of Lagos and he loved maths a lot. So
And so they all
so that was
they all
just like,
inspired
everyone
you.
was just talking about maths all the time. So that was my childhood. So it was like I had a fascination for mathematics since I was 9, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go take mathematics as far as I can.
It's interesting. So how do you balance that? I mean, you're a family man with a very scientific mind. How do you balance that, family and science? What's that been like for you?
I'll just get everybody involved in science. So
Easy fix.
so it's fun. So we have, it's just a dialogue. So it's always exciting to be able to have conversation about science, about physics, about
So everyone
chemistry.
is a scientist in your home, then I guess.
Not everybody is a scientist, but everybody had a bent towards science, so we can always have those kind of conversations. So
Okay.
I enjoy those kind of conversation with my kids as they grow up and then
Speaking of
university.
that, though, because I know that one of the clips I saw, you were talking about your key distinction being that you ensure that your products are good for all hair types.
Sure.
And you said that inspiration actually came from your daughter's experience. Walk us through that.
Yeah, she's a competitive swimmer. She's been swimming since she was 8 years old. She started swimming because I couldn't teach her how to swim because I didn't know how to swim then.
Do you know now?
Let's leave that for now. And she got, she enjoyed it and she continued swimming. And when it was time for us, we thought, okay, well, you've got to the level now that you can stop. Having almost like had to cajole her when she was young to start swimming because she hated water. She hated swimming. She hated everything about swimming, but we thought it was safe for her to learn how to swim.
Yeah.
So then having, got enough lessons, got comfortable with it, and it's now time to stop. She had a really brilliant instructor, and she was like, no, I don't want to stop anymore. So she said, okay, well, let's do it for a little bit longer. I did a little bit longer, then a little bit longer, and it just kept on and on and on and on and on, and it's not stopped. So she's now 22, and she's still, swimming competitively. Yeah.
Interesting. But then, what did the swimming have to do with her hair or any of that?
Yeah, so the challenges for a swimmer, is like if you're swimming at that level, you're spending 20, 25 hours underwater every week. So are you swimming every day, morning and evening? So a lot of the time, the options of not washing your hair, it's not there. So you have to wash your hair, you have to wash the chlorine off, you have to look after the hair. And what tend to happen is that you need to manage. Essentially, you need to use more products. And that's the bottom line. Particularly for people from African descent, the hair present a different kind of challenge compared to Europeans. And you need there is a need to do something slightly different in terms of hair care for people with darker skin phenotypes. And that has been a gap in the market. There has been a gap in science for such a long time. And because of the nature of my work, I've researched a lot in these areas, and and it's quite clear, about the lack of insight and understanding in terms of hair particularly among African, but also, in Asia and other parts of the world. The biology that produces the curly texture there is very different from the biology that produces straight blonde hair. And the manifestation of, the tresses and the hair types, present different kind of challenges that require different kind of intervention. And that is quite obvious to me as a problem solver, which is what I've always done. To say, okay, well, we need to address some of these issues. And that's what led to creating a whole product. And you can't just create a product for one person, you have to create a brand. And that's taken us a whole new journey to creating a product, creating a brand, making it accessible to people and building a whole new, business opportunities around addressing the need of people with textured hair that might have challenges with finding products, for hair care.
I like that because, I mean, you're touching right on something that I think is very key here. One is identifying this need, because obviously you spotted it in your daughter and you knew there had to be a larger audience that needed this. But talk, I mean, I'm trying to find where that transition happened from the mathematician
Yeah.
to the beautician.
Yeah.
where and how did that happen? What
Well, it's a
inspired that journey?
long story.
Walk us through it in a short way, if we can. Like how did
Okay.
you go from that to that?
So I finished my doctorate degree in maths. I did postdoc in the US, theoretical astrophysics. So then came back to Newcastle to get involved in biology. So the genome has been sequenced at that time,
Okay.
and there is a terabyte of data waiting, to be analyzed. So I was working in computer science at that time. So I've come back from the US, and somebody said, you should be making a lot of money from this data, but we don't know how to do that. So that's how I got into biology, because the same principles of analyzing, data science principles also applies to analyzing complex data, even though it's coming from biology. And that's what I got involved in. And we were, looking at this data and, to make hypotheses as to what this data is telling us in terms of the biology of the human body and what impact will compound have on a biological system. And that became quite successful, funding wise. We led a technical team, which was spun out from Newcastle University as a company, to look into application of those data in terms of different therapeutic areas. So that was going back to 2003, 2004, when there's a very little knowledge as to how you can use computer models to actually solve biological problems. So I led a team, and we got lucky. We were very successful in what we did. The company, went into stock exchange, went down to London, raised a lot of money. But I stayed back in Newcastle because I've had family, I've got kids there, and nobody really want to relocate, down south. And that is how HexisLab started as a company. And the interest in HexisLab was to use, mathematical principles of modeling, computer science simulations to understand how to solve biological problems.
Nice.
And an application area that was, interesting at that time and still interesting now is to look at skincare and hair care industry, beauty industry, nutraceutical industry, because those are the areas that never really gets enough deep research, involved in them. So the idea was to use all these mathematical models and simulation models to begin to create solutions, that addresses the need, within those, particular, in this particular market. And also to understand the differences in different skin phenotypes, try to create a solution that is a little bit more personalized, that addresses different needs from, different concerns. So that is how I move into, in pretty much, without planning it, without thinking about it, moving to beauty and personal care. That's started 14 years ago. We're still going as a company.
Amazing.
And we've been service providers to different number of different brands using machine learning tools, AI tools to predict and to work out, formulations and products that people can use in different, different application, and also testing and validating some of those results in the lab here in Newcastle. So that's been a journey that I've been on. So, and that is what has led me into hair care, but it's not the end yet. So it's just the beginning.
So what would you say is more of the superpower now? Because I hear two things. There is the critical mind that analyzes data, but I also see a very curious mind as well. So which is it? Curiosity or the love for data or the ability to analyze the data?
I would say both. I can't really,
Yeah.
separate the two. So, yeah, and sometimes, business becomes challenging because you want to keep solving problems, because something else is interesting, another thing is interesting. And at one point in time, you have to stop, curiosity in order to be able to do something, that is practical as well as functional that brings, benefits, to different people. So I think the curiosity is never going to stop. I love, good problems to solve. And you solve problems with two things, with data and with analysis. So the analysis could be, anything really, in terms of what you use to apply to solve the problem, the interpretation of the data. So like hair care industry, the problem with textured hair, the problem with, that is based on observable data. Okay, well, here is a problem, here is the definition of it, how do we go about solving it? And that has been my journey through my life, in terms of finding a good problem to solve.
I once had someone on the show a couple of weeks back, and he's still a PhD student who's talking about, and we were talking about how a lot of African ideas die in the labs, but you have managed to turn research into real world products, and built a massive company around it, What would be your advice to that person who is a scientist stuck in a lab trying to figure out how do I go from this knowledge to the market?
Courage. You've got to have a lot of courage to take the next step, and patience, perseverance, because it gets, things gets harder. The more you try to get to the next level in terms of push to the next level. So is about conviction about what you believe in, and also making sure you get a good, honest assessment as to what problem you're trying to solve. Okay, if you have something that you love doing, you've got a hobby. If you have something that somebody else need, then you have a business. So it's about working out what is the difference. Am I enjoying this, and I want to turn my hobby into work. Some people achieve that in life. It's but not very, very few people are able to do that. But the real successful people tend to look at, what do people need, and how can I apply myself to solve that problem? And a lot of the time, those are very simple problems, not very complicated things. And that is one of the challenges that, bright minds always have, is that you can't see a simple solution anymore, because everything
It's always complicated.
is all complicated, because you can see the different dimensions as to how to solve the problem, even if the problem doesn't even exist. So it's about finding out what the gap is, what the problem you're trying to solve, and making sure that you do not go beyond the scope of the brief that you've received from the end user as to this is a problem they want to solve.
Take the feedback from the market and build around
and
that.
build around that. That is always a good way of starting.
Give me 30 seconds to interrupt your interview very quickly. The reason I make these videos is because for far too long, the African story has been told by other people but us. And so, at Critical Factor, the core goal is to spotlight African excellence wherever it is across the world. And if that is something that resonates with you, please support the channel by simply subscribing to the channel and, of course, sharing this so that other people can see it. And without saying too much, let's get back to the interview. There's also the reality, though, that a lot of people would struggle because of funding. You have mastered that. You raised hundreds, millions of pounds for your companies.
Not hundreds of millions, yes.
Well, I said hundreds of thousands, and then I upgraded that to millions because indeed, there was a time you raised over £490,000, I think, for R&D, and I know you've done several more rounds of that. So, what would be your advice to that person who needs to raise funding? What are certain things that you would advise entrepreneurs or scientists to put in place if they want to position themselves to be able to actually access funding?
Raising funds is very, very, it's a whole new conversation. It's very complex. I guess the first thing for us is you have to understand your context. What environment you are in, because everybody is doing something doesn't mean that the rules apply. The rules are applied equally, and you should expect the same as well. People, unfortunately, we live in a society that is based on prejudice. So there are lots of preferences that goes on when it comes to funding and a lot of issues surrounding that. So you've got to understand your context. Who am I, where I am, what contacts and relationships that I have, and how successful will it be, to apply for this or that kind of funding. So if you look at some of the stuff that we've done, we've not, gone down some of the conventional route of raising funds. I've always been focused on solving problems. So I've got a problem that I'm trying to solve. So how do I pull people, team, resources together and apply our mind to see how we're going to solve that problem? And that is what has led into, some of those successful, fundraise. Usually, a lot of the time with academic partners to say, okay, well, this is the problem we're trying to solve. This is how we're going to solve it, and this is how benefit it's going to have. And then try to find those, strategies to be able to raise investment into that, for that particular problem that needs to be solved, because how those solutions can be applied in other people's in other contexts.
So I think the application is what you're talking about. Like, if you can't justify the application, then it's hard to find investors who will be willing to put money behind it.
And yes, and more than that, sometimes there's product market fit as well. So what you're trying to create, is there a market for it? And if there's no market for it, who do I need to partner with, or how do I need to connect with other people in order for us to be able to achieve that? Then the other thing as well is that the money that you're raising, is it enough for you to be able to see it from beginning to the end? Because a lot of the time, the UK investment scene is, pretty much around startup capital. It's about, lots of good ideas that started that never gets to the end, because there is no scale-up funding that allows you to go to the next level unless you move down south to London, to Oxford area, or to move to the US. That is where the scale-up funding is. That's where idea turns into business a lot of the time. So again, you have to recognize that the ecosystem that you exist in, that, okay, I might get a good investment, to start my idea here, but if I need to scale it up, it might be, I have to move. I have to go and find the right geography, the right people, the right location, for that ideas to, for the business idea to survive. So understanding your ecosystem, understanding the people that surround you, understanding your team, having a clarity on the product market fit, what the consumer really want, because it's not obvious, is one of the ways of achieving success in terms of fundraise and scaling up.
Gotcha. And I mean, you are scientifically minded, and so when you're thinking about growth, how have you managed that through your companies? Because obviously, I think one of the things you once said, which we touched on briefly, is you said you learn discipline to stop curiosity.
Yeah.
And I found that line quite interesting, so I kind of noted it. And I wanted you to kind of jump on that in terms of how then do we grow if we're not curious? Sure. But then how do we balance that curiosity, in terms of scaling?
So you reward yourself with, so curiosity is a reward, of having achieved something. So I have to do this every day, pretty much every hour, to be honest. So I indulge myself with curious thought and invention and new ideas, or new application, or a new code that I want to write. If I finish, the task that is boring, mundane, that I hate doing, but it's essential.
Right.
And it's such a hard thing to juggle. I'd rather spend the entire day just, creating new code,
Creating.
writing new ideas, developing new concepts, based on my observation of what is needed. But that doesn't necessarily translate into what people are asking for. But that is my comfort zone. That is where I enjoy. I live in that world where I can keep coming up with new ideas. You have to put your feet down and say, okay, well, yeah, it's time to do something practical.
I think Layla and Keys, that's one of your core products.
Yep.
And I mean, now you have gone internationally, you've developed this, you've launched it internationally. Tell us a bit about that. How has that journey been, building that?
It's been based on relationships. So over the years, we've always kept up, with good relationships that you build in business, and those relationships do matters in terms of being able to go to the next level, because you can't afford to pay for every single thing that you need to do. So previous relationships and previous contacts that became aware of what I was doing in terms of developing the products, because of the reputation I had with them, thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. So let's have a look at it. And that's what they've done. They looked at it and they thought, okay, well, we can really do something more with this. So, and that's been fantastic, because I've invested in those relationships, I've invested in those contacts, and it's now bearing fruit, even though never did anything with them for 20 years. But 20 years down the line, it's like, okay, well, yeah, there's something we can work together on. So it's always good to have those network. Eventually your network is your network. The people that you know matters. It's good to connect with people, build a relationship, work on your network, work on your relationship, find ways of helping, other people to solve their own problem, because in the process of doing that, that it comes back to you.
Symbiotic relationship is built then, yeah.
You build some kind of relationship.
And I know that the brand went on to receive awards literally within, I think, a few months of launching it.
Yeah.
How rewarding was that for you at that moment?
It was great. I mean, it was fantastic, because I wasn't expecting it. We thought it would take, years to be able to build awareness of brand. But when we launched the product, we knew what we were doing, in terms of, we know there is a clear market gap. Nobody's addressing this, and it's a problem that nobody loves to do. So, I mean, we wrote research publication about the product even before we launched it. Nobody wrote research publication about shampoos. But we thought, what? His idea is so great. We want to share about, the innovation and the ideas of what we're trying to do, so that other people can benefit from it. Mm-hmm. So I think that helped us as well, because we started with the science communication even before we launched the website for the product.
Interesting.
To make sure that we're not only doing something that is impactful, but also is transformational and game-changing. Mm-hmm. So we're delighted that was recognized, with the Pure Beauty Award, which is one of the biggest, well, it is the biggest beauty award in, organization in the UK. We won the silver, which was really quite rewarding.
Speaking about relationships still, which I think is something you're big on, busy as you are, you still find time to organize and create community. Why are you so passionate about that? Why does that matter?
It is important to not just focus on your own problems, about what you need to do for yourself, but to help other people within your that you have the means to be able to help, and support them in their journey as well. So it is important for me to find ways of supporting and helping people, and I've always done that over the years. I mean, I grew up in an environment like that as a child, that my parents were very supportive of the community, a large group of people, always seeing them as the center of gravity, the person that they can always come to for for solutions. So I haven't done, a lot. I haven't been involved in so many things. At the end of the day, it's you've got to give, something back. You've got to, support other people in their journey as well, because that is one of the ways you pass on, some of the, some of the achievements that that you have, and some of the knowledge and the wisdom that you've acquired. And there's no better time to do it, but now, some people wait till they retire and try to figure out how to help people, in their journey. But I thought it was part of my DNA that in building what I'm building, I want to support other people to achieve success as well, to be able to build better.
I mean, I definitely have spoken to a lot of people who can attest to the fact that your mentorship has been invaluable to them. So, I mean, thank you for what you do in the community. I think you're definitely are making an impact. You are changing a lot of lives, you know. But I also then want to pull on that wealth of knowledge which you have, because now you are a scientist, you are a CEO, you've met people, you run a multi-million pound business.
Not multi-million pound yet, but getting closer.
Humility, I like that. But then you run this mammoth. You've been everywhere. You know, if you were to look at people and to that person who's listening and say, if you were to advise and say, here are the characteristics of folks who will succeed at what they do. If there were things in their lives they should look at and say, look, work on these things, and I can tell you, we can pretty much predict where that future will go based on the data. What would be some of those characteristics that you think people need to work on to be successful?
Wow, gosh, there's a lot, you can throw in there, but you've got to stay curious. You've got to, observe the world around you. What are the needs? What are the problems? What are the challenges? What are the issues that people are facing? Stay curious. Look at, be alert. Stay awake. Keep an eye on what is going on, and do a deep dive on yourself. Try to understand who you are. Because a lot of the time, everything that you need you already have, but you're just not conscious of it. So being able to do a deep analysis on who you are, what is your strength, what is your weakness, what are you good at, what do people say you're good at. Talk to your mom. I mean, they will tell you things that you never would have realized about yourself. Talk to people and find out what people say you're good at. Mesh that into your personal brand, your statement, the value proposition that you bring to the world, and look at the problems, look at what I can do, and find out, okay, what problem, because you cannot solve every problem. So, what problems can I solve based on the skills that I have and the network that I have? Because at the end of the day, everybody, exists to solve, other people's problem. It's not just about the way you get benefit is by solving other people's problems. That's why you get a job. That is how you get a business. That is how you succeed in pretty much everything in life. So, stay curious. Look at what is going on. Find out more about who you are and how your core DNA and your network that you have, the relationship that you have, can help you, solve the problem. If I can add, one more thing to it, is just stay in a community, connect with people, find a mentor, not just the people that are around you. Find people that are different from you. You know, um, or better still, go and find people that have achieved what you dream you want to achieve. And ask them to give you the playbook. And work backwards from that. It might be very difficult to find those people because they are not easily accessible. But within your environment, try and connect with people that are different from you, because that is how you're going to learn something different. If you hang out with the same people that say the same thing, that look like you, that talk like you, that are constantly reinforcing the things that you've always known, you're not going to break out, of that community. I mean, if good analogy that I always like is Lords of the Rings. Everybody has to get it. It's got to be a journey. You've got to go somewhere. You've got to, go from A to B for you to be able to achieve something. And that is what you see in every basic story. Either you're overcoming a monster, you're going on a quest, there is a journey, there is a voyage and return. So those are the ethos of the basic stories of life. You've got to have a quest, and that would take you out of your comfort zone. And that comfort zone is like breaking out from your little bubble, which has been, a place of safety, a place of incubation, to be able to go and achieve something different.
There's a book I think titled "The Obstacle Is the Way." I think
Yes.
that's a good one. So embrace the difficulty, embrace the obstacles.
I mean, my favorite book is by Christopher Booker. It's called The Seven Basic Plots. So essentially, what he said is that every book that you've ever read, storybook, every film you've ever watched, or any play that you've ever seen, is only 7 plots to it. There's nothing more than that.
It falls in one of those.
It falls into one of those, and if you can understand the 7 basic plots, everything kind of slotting into places, because, and that is what the films are reinforcing. The books you're reading, the friction, everything is falling along the same 7 basic plots about 7 different types of journey that you experience. And you have multiple journeys from one point, at one point in your life, or somebody will just go on a particular track. Right. It's a very big book, so it takes a long time. It takes a long time to read.
Okay. I mean, as we try to tie up, I know HexisLab is big on AI. You've been doing a lot in that space, and if you look at the world we live in, and if you were to give a prediction over the next 10 years, for instance, how do you see AI impacting pharma or, any industry, in fact? How do you see it impacting, and what kind of response should we be having towards AI in general?
That's a big question. I could spend a whole day on that. So AI is here to stay, and there's a lot of good things about that, and also there's a lot of potential, harm or negative consequences of that. Now, the large language models, as we know it, is really nothing new. It's been around for a long time. And I remember in 2005, actually, if I remember correctly, I wrote a paper which I presented in France when I was working in computer science on predicting text based on volume of text that you already have. So, which is the same, large language models, but we're using something a lot more esoteric at that time. We're using what we call the coordinate networks, which is an advanced way of mathematically programming, what text should come after you have a body of text. So it's nothing new. It's been around for years. What has changed is the computational power, the speed of, the machine and the processors that are available now. Accessibility of data in a way that we've never seen them before. The data has grown so much. So you can do more quicker, faster prediction, and it's just accelerating itself more and more and more. The limitation of AI is that it's learning based on the existing knowledge, that is had. A little bit breaking out of this, that knowledge and making inferences. But the human's ability to be able to come up with something completely different, if they do not outsource their creativity to existing knowledge through AI, is still enormous and vast. And I think there's so many problems that are still we're still not able to solve yet. Even with some of these AI models, there's still going to be a lot of challenge. We're going to have breakthrough in medicine. We're going to have breakthrough in so many areas in terms of sciences. Things that are going to be faster and easier to do. I think I've probably written more code in the last 3 months than I've written in my entire life. Because it's easy now to write applications. So it's like I had to stop myself because Just need to think about the next, thing. Problem I wanted to solve 20 years ago that I didn't have the time, the resources,
And
or the
now you can.
infrastructure to do it. Now, for the fun of it, I'll just build that app. Not for anybody, just complete indulgence. So there's a lot more you can do now, more than you can never do before. But the fundamental problem still exists. I don't think we've discovered up to 10% of what we can discover in mathematics as a subject. I think there is a vast amount of ocean of incredible new things that we can explore. I think we just starting physics. We still do not understand the basic law of gravitational instability or electromagnetic induction. Those are or the dimensions that exist in describing space and time. The planets, the space. Somebody has to travel to the stars. What are the rules? Of being able to do that. Somebody has to go to Mars. So there is a vast amount of unknowns. But what AI will do is that it will help us to solve those problems quicker and faster. So if I was a child growing up now, I thought this is the most exciting time to be alive.
Yeah.
If I was interested in science, I'll focus on the natural sciences because I think that is the only thing. To be honest, I'll go back to the curriculum of the 12th century, so where they did the natural sciences and the arts, and those things will probably last, or at last the AI, your natural sciences or maths, physics, chemistry, biology. Then there's so much problems to be solved that AI is not going to replace the human ingenuity, that will need to solve those problems. It means that we'll be able to solve a lot more problems, a lot more quicker, but there's still more problems that will uncover as a result of it. For the social sciences, I'll do history. History and politics, human nature, psychology, those things are never going to change. And the whole new discipline is going to emerge. Probably we'll have psychologists that, need to help humans, on how to interact with machines. It will create a whole new raft of, rules and regulation and laws and accounting and all the rest of it. So I think it's an exciting time to be alive. There is so much more that you can now do that will require a huge amount of investment and a big team for you to be able to achieve that. But now you can actually do that, as an individual.
Interesting. We have a closing tradition where we ask guests what they believe is the critical factor to success in general. So for you, if you were to think about what that one thing is that you think is the critical factor to success as a scientist, as an individual, as a CEO, what would that be?
It's perseverance, fortitude to keep going, even things might be difficult. And that fortitude sometimes comes from, different places. Sometimes it comes from your community. Sometimes it comes from your faith. Sometimes it comes from, self-belief that you have in yourself. But that tenacity, not to give up, and the desire to keep going despite the obstacles and the hindrances is a critical factor that will enable you to succeed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Sola, for being here. I mean, it's been a lot we touched on, not as much as we would have wanted because of time, but then I think it's been very informative, whether we're talking about the business side of things, the future of AI, and of course the amazing things you're doing at HexisLab. And we'll keep following the journey, and we wish you all the best. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.